A behind-the-scenes look at how games are made and the people who make them. This is Game Dev Deconstructed. Hello and welcome to another episode of Game Dev Deconstructed. I'm your host, Nick Culbertson, and I'm here today with Michael Duffy. That is at MuckyRobot on Twitter, MuckyRobot. Michael is the programming department manager at Game Circus, where he's been since 2012. Prior to working at Game Circus, Michael worked as a technical director in the computer graphics film industry, contributing to such films as How to Train Your Dragon, Megamind, and Madagascar 3, just to name a few. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I also know Michael from a meetup that we host. It's called Dallas App Developers, where you've presented before, and also from our punnily named Appy Night Out, where we've exchanged some war stories and things that we've gone through, sort of what's happening in the industry.
Yeah, for the past, it's been probably 4 years now, we'll meet up and at a bar and throw some darts and just talk about app development and whatever everyone's working on.
Yeah, and I think we probably wouldn't be on this podcast without your motivational nudging.
I enjoyed goading you into this.
Yes. So I want to just start right in on your bio. Also, I should mention that Game Circus has... Maybe you could talk a little bit about your role at Game Circus.
So at Game Circus, we're a mobile game company that targets the casual market. And the company started with a number of smaller apps, and then the founders released a game called Dozer, and it's a coin pusher type game, and it hit the audience just right, and it's one of the best versions of the coin pusher games out there. And from that, they built a number of other casual games to the point where we are today, where we have Paplinko and Prize Claw 2 and Taps to Riches, and we're working on a new game called Clash Tactics right now. So it's been a really good company to be at for the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, and it seems like I've seen Dozer is in the top 100 downloaded apps for Android basically forever. It just lives there.
It's been there in the top of the charts for its category for over 5 years now. The company, I think, is about 7 years old. And the company learned really early on about how to put games out. So our business group really knows how to focus on launching with the user acquisition and doing advertising and really getting the word out there. And then the programming and art teams have been just improving it every 3 or 4 weeks pretty much for the past 6 or 7 years, and released a few different versions of it. And so I've really kind of seen how mobile games are really software as a service. You don't just put it out there, hope for the best. You put it out there, and then you keep working on it, and you keep improving it and look at areas where it's weak, look at the metrics for how it's doing, how are you retaining, are you monetizing, when do you lose your players, and then you change the game in order to fix the areas that you see need addressing.
And so how frequent are you posting updates in the app stores?
So we have 3 different teams at Game Circus, and each one of them is they're staggered by a week, and so they work on 3-week sprints, and at the end of the sprint we release something to the store. Sometimes it's to multiple platforms. We'll release to Google Play and to iOS. We used to be able to release to Google Play, Amazon, and iOS all in the same week. But we also have all of our QA internal. So if we haven't done a good job or if there are bugs, QA says, no, we don't feel good with this going out, and we don't put it out. So, but by and large, each team is releasing an update to their product every 3 weeks.
Okay, that seems, as an individual, that would be very quick. But I guess with the team working on it, and how many employees are at Game Circus?
So I think Game Circus is up around 54-ish people right now.
Okay, and your team leader over how many programs?
So we have, I think, 9 programmers across 3 different teams. And that's the front-end programmers. We work in a program called Unity, Unity 3D, and that handles all of the graphics and the physics and stuff like that. And then we are developing all of the game logic, all the logic that ties into third-party toolkits. We do all the art internal, basically from concept to shipping and then maintaining it and servicing it afterwards. We have everything in-house for all our games.
Okay. And so I think we're definitely going to jump around on a lot of different topics. But so now I want to reel back. Okay. I want to go to a younger Michael Duffy. So how did you make the transition with your background of the movie industry and then jump over to the world of game development?
So when I was in high school, I did a animated project, a hand-drawn animated project, and stayed up all night for a few weekends working on it, and with the plan of entering it in a local community college's art contest for high school students. So that year, that college happened to cancel their media category, and so I didn't have anywhere to send my finished animation. And the librarian at our school found a high school competition at another college and sent my project off, and I won a prize in it. And that school was USC, University of Southern California. So they sent me information on their film school, and I saw that this is where George Lucas had graduated from. And Star Wars has always been like a big kind of turning point in my life. I love the movie, love the universe, and it had me always wondering, how do you make movies? How do you do special effects? And so when I got this information from USC's film school, I'm like, okay, so cinema is an actual career that real people do. And I applied and got in, and with the intent of working in the live action film industry out in California, out in Los Angeles. So went out there, learned a lot at USC, a great program, but I found out that I didn't really like living in Los Angeles. But at the same time, while I was out at school, I was learning how to program on my own time. And so I learned assembly and Pascal and C++ and C, and decided to go into video games. So when I graduated from USC, I actually looked around, and I was interested in a platform called OS2 at the time, which was a alternative to the Windows world. And I found a company called Stardock Systems up in Michigan that did OS2 software and OS2 games. And so I applied and got into working on their games for OS2. And that's kind of how I started off in film and then went into video games. Because I've always loved video games. When I was a kid, I would go to the video arcade. I'm like 10-year-old and going to the Crystal's Pizza, and they had this huge arcade in the basement, and I'd just walk around and look at the various games and try to figure out how they worked. And so this is back when Pac-Man and Frogger and Gorf and all those games were popular. And so I just wondered what made them tick. What did you have to do in order to make games? And so, when I was in junior high, I programmed on an Atari 800. That's where I kind of got my start. Didn't do anything in high school. Picked it up in college again, and then after college, went into it professionally.
Okay, so it sounds like you have a background of being the guy who is building the things.
Yes.
Being very technical on that end of things. And it seems like now you're in a position where you are handling the people who are building the thing. So maybe this would be a good transition to talk about, what does your typical day look like now at Game Circus?
Right now, I don't have my hand on code as much as I used to, and probably as much as I'd like to. So I oversee the programmers at Game Circus and try to help out with architecture, with software design, with training where I can. So my day is pretty much, we'll start off the day with a stand-up meeting for the sprint where all the team members get together and talk about what they've been working on. and I'll keep my eye open for any areas that are being developed or are having problems. And so if we have a new system coming online, I'll jump in and help figure out how it's architected, and I'll really help try to facilitate communication between our client programmers who are working in Unity and our back-end programmers who are working on all the web services that our game uses, or if we interface with a third-party service, try to make sure that all the communication is smooth so that we can build the software and have it be bug-free and working.
So would you say most of your day is you're on the phone or sitting at the computer or talking to people?
I don't have a phone at my desk. So we are on either Google Hangouts or email. We have an open office, so it's no big deal to get up and have someone walk over to me and ask a question. I'll get up and find someone who I need to pick their brain on. And so it's a lot of talking and conversation and getting the right people talking to one another, and also to make sure that we have thought out the structure of the software completely. So, as mentioned earlier, our games, we don't just send it out and release it. These are games and systems that have to be able to be maintained for years and years. And if you build on a shaky foundation, you're just not going to be able to do that. The product will crumble under its own weight. So you really do need software that's well organized, that follows conventions, that is logically built together, is modular, so that you can maintain this software in the long term, and also that you only have to build it once. That's kind of a big thing that I focus on, is making sure when we're building a system, we think in terms of reuse and making sure that we write it once, debug it once. We may have to adjust it or refactor it later on, but the best, once you get software stable, if you don't mess with it, it should stay stable. And so we want to get in and mess with finished systems as little as possible.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think as an independent, I have done the opposite, where a lot of times it's you start from a prototype and next thing you know, you're building a game off of this prototype that, there's some buggy solutions, but it works, So coming back to that later isn't always ideal. So what is sort of the design process before people start actually touching the code?
So it all kind of starts off with the idea. So the designer's going to come up with the idea of what they want to do, what game system they want to do, or they'll usually start with a goal of, we want to increase player retention at, let's say day 3. So they'll look at where people are in playing the game at day 3, and they'll think of ways that how do we keep people around? What is their experience that we can improve in order to make them want to play longer? So they'll come up with a design and hand that off to art for coming up with concepts, and they'll hand it off to programming to figure out how to actually implement it. And we'll start off by just talking back and forth with them and figure out what is feasible. What is the scope? Do we have time for it? What is technically possible or not? What can we use as an existing code versus what we have to build up from scratch? So once we've decided what the feature is going to be, then the programmers need to figure out the actual flow of data. So what is the user inputting? Where does that data go? Where is it stored? Are we talking to web services or RESTful services? Are we storing it locally? How often are we refreshing the data? How are we presenting it to the player? And so we have to figure out the flow of how everything works. Write that down, however much we need to, and then we estimate time. And as I said, we work in a 3-week sprint, and that's broken up in 2 weeks of development and 1 week of QA and bug fixing. So all of our features we try to fit within a 2-week time period. And then we'll scope it for that, and if it's too large, then we need to break it up in part 1, part 2, part 3, and each part able to be done within a single sprint. Then once we have committed to the time, the sprint rolls around and we'll get in there and actually do the implementation.
Okay, and I'm not sure if people are interested in this or not, but I really like the process part of it. Are you using Scrum for these things?
Yeah, so when I keep on saying sprint, there's a software approach called agile software development. And the way that software used to be done is called waterfall, and that means that you come up with a grand design and a big old design document, hundreds of pages, and this is what your program's going to be. You hand it to your developers, and they spend months, implementing this design, and at the end of several months, or years, you hand it off to your customers. That doesn't always work so well. So agile development is where you take much smaller bite-sized pieces and you do in 2, 3-week, 4-week sprints, they're called. So you do, in our case, 3 weeks of development, hand it off to customers, see what they like, see what they don't like, and then that informs your next sprint or the sprint after. So you're constantly changing your ideas on what needs to be developed and what needs to be focused on, and you generally only plan 2 or 3 sprints out. And past that, you have a general idea of what you want to do, but it can be fuzzy and you can change it. So that also means that if something is wrong in your design or it goes out there and it just doesn't click with players, you're not going to react to it 6 months to a year later. You're going to react to it 3 to 6 weeks later. And that allows you to be a lot more responsive to your customer base.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach to have with it. How do you feel the product needs to look at its initial launch?
So what you ship out is referred to as MVP, which is minimum viable product. So, and
even at your initial launch, because I feel like with the App Store specifically, you need to have a product at launch that's featureable. So it looks like this is fully baked. Maybe I have the wrong impression of MVP in that I'm thinking an MVP can kind of look half-baked.
No. So an MVP, it should be a complete product, but it should be the least amount of product that you can put out. So it should still have, the finished graphics, but, if you're doing a game with several levels, maybe you're only releasing the first 2 to 3 levels as MVP.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's what Angry Birds did with like Angry Birds Space when they put it out. Had just the first pack of levels, but Game Circus, like Taps to Riches, on launch was widely featured. Maybe what was something that was different from that initial launch to where it is now?
So, for example, when Taps to Riches originally launched, it had a smaller number of advisors that you could collect. The map is broken up into different worlds, and so at launch it probably only had maybe 2 or 3 worlds, and not I don't know how many it has now, maybe 6. And so as we've developed it, we've added more worlds, we add more advisors. Things like festivals wasn't in at initial launch. And so some of the kind of add-on, things like a daily bonus wouldn't be in at first launch. Maybe one ad provider would be in, but not all of them, depending on where you are in your development. So you'll have one way to monetize, but maybe not all the different ways to monetize. And we also, once we come up with the MVP, that's what is shippable. Then we go into what the industry calls soft launch. And so you'll take your product and you'll release it to a limited number of countries. And the stores, whether it be Apple or Google, allow you to target where your product is released. So you'll choose a country that is going to act kind of like North America, but isn't North America and is much smaller. So, let's say we choose the Philippines. Let's say we choose France. You can take a country, release your game there, and see how it does. And then you do some user acquisition, and you get your ads in front of the eyes of people living in those countries. You get a few hundred or thousand users in, and you see what they think of your game. You see how they behave. You look at the metrics, determine where are they dropping off, where are they churning. Do you need to improve your tutorial? Are they understanding how to play the game? When are they interacting with the different aspects of your game? So if you had this great idea for a feature in your game and you put it out and you find out that no one's actually using that feature, no one's going to that screen, well, then you don't need to put any more development time into it. Either you can cut it and put your development time in a feature that people are actually liking, or that you have to put development time to revise that feature because it's not as fun as you thought it was. It's not as engaging as you thought it was.
Yeah, that reminds me, I listened to an interview with Mark Zuckerberg, and he was talking about with Facebook how they're running 10, maybe 1,000, 10,000 different versions of Facebook at one time, and they can send out a small version that they can target just 1,000 users or 10,000 users, how many they need to validate this test that they're doing, and then taking that data to refine their product to a point where people are spending more time on Facebook because they have the analytics to back that up. So I think approaching development with having these metrics in mind is a great way to build a big boy business in software development. But it certainly doesn't sound glamorous, like it's as compared to making an independent game. My approach has been, I play this thing, I put it in front of people. If it seems to click with them, if my gut tells me it's good, I'll put it out. But there's not really the metric other than the two ones. How many downloads am I getting? How much money am I making from this product? And looking at reviews. So how do you facilitate gathering the data to know if this feature is working or not? Like what specific tools are you using? Are they baked into maybe the ad providers on the impressions, or is it using Flurry or things like this?
And that's an area that I'm personally learning more about all the time as well. So I'm working on my own app in my spare time, and part of it, the reason I'm doing it is to learn areas that I don't get direct experience with at work. So, for example, I'm not in there analyzing the data, the metrics that we get back on our games at work. So I'm interested in seeing how that all plays out in my own app. And so I've chosen a kind of a very simple genre to start with. I'm writing a Hangman app. And so I've integrated Google's Firebase Analytics in there. And so it will tell me how often people are playing, how long their play session is. It's going to have multiple levels of word sets that you'll work your way through. So I can see which word sets are difficult and people are having trouble with versus which ones are easy. And then I'll be able to move the word sets around later in order to balance difficulties so that it's easier to start with and then ramps up in difficulty. I'll be able to tell, when I'm losing people. And so if, people get, 3 days or 4 days into the game and then they stop playing, I know that I need to introduce a new feature around that time in order to pique their interest. And so I need to open up a new mechanic to the game. I need to give them a prize, something to work towards. And so when you look at yes, you're going to have sales, but that just tells you, how many people have downloaded your game or how many people have bought it or, possibly whether people are watching ads or buying in-app purchases. And if you look at the store reviews, those are going to be a lot of times the squeaky wheel. That's what people use to report bugs. And if they get angry at your game or if they love it, then they'll go and leave a review on your store page. But those are, like I said, the squeaky wheels. Those are the ones who stand up and say something that may not represent the vast majority of your players. And so the only way to understand what most of your players are doing and feeling is by looking at their actions. And so depending on your game, you decide what actions to look at in order to figure out what your players are doing. If you have an exploration game, are they finding all the different areas? Are they collecting the prizes that you put out? Because especially if you're an indie dev, you're very limited in the amount of content that you can create. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck. And if you're creating a bunch of content that no one is actually seeing, no one's actually experiencing, then that's just wasted effort, because you want your players to experience what you're creating. And so by looking at the metrics, you can tell, are they actually seeing what I put out there? Are they seeing it at the rate that I expected them to? Are people going through the game too fast? Because when you add content to a game, sometimes you have to decide, am I adding it at the first few days of the game, or is it for someone who's been playing my game for months? And you can look at the metrics and say, well, where's my player base? Do I have a lot of players who have reached the latter stages of my game, or is the bulk of everyone still in the first few weeks of the content? And so you can decide, if I'm going to have so many weeks of effort to put into this game to improve it, am I going to aim for 80% of my player base, or the 5% that has gotten to the very highest levels? And by looking at the metrics, you can actually, you're not going in blind. You know who you're targeting and who could possibly see the content you're developing.
Yeah, it seems like it helps you to find a target and shoot at it, as opposed to I'm not getting the downloads I want, I'm going to change some arbitrary thing that might make the game feel better, as opposed to saying, oh, people keep dropping off on the second level, maybe it's too difficult, or maybe they're getting lost. Do you think that Google Analytics is sort of, or Google Firebase is sort of the thing people are using?
No, I think there's a lot of them out there. So I've seen Google Analytics, which Google Firebase is the app-based version of that. I've seen that used. I've seen Flurry used. I've seen Iron Source used. There's a lot of different providers out there for collecting different information. Lean Plum is another big one out there. They have their different strengths and weaknesses. And so for basic metrics, which is what most indies would have to deal with, most of them are going to provide you what you need. It's only after you kind of really get deep into analytics that you start hitting the ceiling of what those services provide, and then you have to start either rolling your own or talking to them directly to see if they can improve their offering in ways that you need. And that is well beyond where my knowledge currently sits. I know that, for instance, I know that Game Circus has, is hitting the limit of what some of these companies can provide, and then we work with them so that they can improve their offering and get us more fine-tuned metrics for what we're looking for. But I personally don't run into those, and that's what I'm going to eventually learn, I hope.
Yeah. Well, it's really cool. I mean, that's something I now want to look into more myself, just to see where people are falling off, mainly, because like you've mentioned, sometimes with the reviews, yes, it is the squeaky wheel, but also if someone really enjoyed the experience, you don't really know what their behavior was inside of the app. So this seems like a a way of really intimately getting to see how people have flowed from the start to the end of your experience you've made. I want to jump back to Game Circus real quick, and in particular, we've been talking about indies. I think a lot of indies are listening to this, and they might be looking for ways to get their foot in the door in the games industry. So what advice would you give for someone looking to try and put their best foot forward in getting in the games industry?
So I approach it from the programming point of view. As programming department manager, I look over all of the programming resumes that come in to Game Circus. And so I've looked at hundreds of resumes at this point. A lot of people are coming straight out of school and just scattershotting their resume wherever they can. And so one thing that I look for is, do you have an interest in games? Have you written games, worked on games? Because if you're just a general computer science student coming out looking for a job and you've never even considered games before, I'm not really interested in you, because I need someone who is interested in the space. The other thing we look for is just overall computer science competency. So I'm a self-trained programmer. I learned on my own from books and from the internet and whatnot, and just a whole lot of practice and reading whatever code I could get my hands on. But I knew as a self-taught programmer that there are areas that I would be weak on. And so I specifically went out to learn in those areas: data structures, design patterns, software construction. And so I studied up on those areas so that I could, actually create software that scales up and is stable. So when I'm looking at resumes, I'm not just looking for someone who, knows the very basics of programming. I'm looking for someone who has a little bit better idea of how to build good software. And I'll ask them, questions about math, about collision detection, about how would you organize this data? What are the trade-offs in speed versus memory? Do they understand memory management? Do they understand how to write faster code? And I'm not talking like super optimized code. I'm just talking avoiding boneheaded mistakes like doing memory allocation in inner loops and stuff like that. Are they conscious of how garbage collection works in the memory managed languages? Do they know what a memory managed language is? So I look for just kind of general competency, interest in games. Experience in games is great, whether it's professional or if they've written it on their own. And for people coming straight out of school, I look for the fact that they've done projects on their own. So the classwork that you do in any major is not enough. You have to go outside of that and work on your own, whether it's film, journalism, computer programming, whatever, writing. You have to put in your own time on your own stuff in order to improve your skills. And so I look to see, has someone, written their own game, published their own game, even if it wasn't all that great. Have they gone through the full process of, from concept to completion to know how to deliver a finished product?
Yeah. What do you think about experience versus education?
I think that it's important for both, because you have to learn to write good software, and you also have to have the experience of writing software. So through education, whether it's formal or on your own, you have to go get the concepts down. And just because you sat in a class doesn't mean you got the concepts. I've run across a lot of people who come out with computer science degrees, but they didn't pay close attention, they didn't practice it, it slipped right out of their heads, and so when I start quizzing them on things, they really don't know. Their knowledge is really shallow. So it's important to learn the concepts, whether you do that formally or intentionally on your own. But at the same time, you have to go out and do it. Early in my career, I worked with a guy who had a master's in computer science, and he comes into the company and had only ever written programs that fit within a single file. And so he had never in his life written a multi-file program. And so here I was self-taught, and I could program circles around him, even though he had much more education than I did, because I had the experience of doing it day in, day out, for a few years. And so I think they're both important, but there's different ways to get both education and experience. You don't have to go to a formal institution to do it, but you do have to actually go out and do it.
So I would agree with that. I do feel like on the applications I always see a prerequisite of a computer science degree, which I think probably isn't necessary, but it might be a stopgap from that person even getting that initial interview. So do you have any tips for people who might not have the formal education, how to even get to the next level of an interview?
Well, it depends on the company. So some companies, especially larger ones, will put that as a filter. You have to have a computer science degree. And others will say computer science degree or equivalent experience. And so the companies that I've worked for in the entertainment industry generally care whether or not you can do it rather than what credentials you have. So if you can come in and show in some way that you have the skills, then they'll look at you. Because take it from the point of view of a hiring manager. They want to get someone in, put them in a seat, and have them be productive in as quick a time as possible. They have problems that need to be solved, and they need to put someone there to solve them. And so any way that you are able to show that you can come in and do the work that that company is doing with as little hand-holding as possible, people will snap you up. And so if you come in with, and say, hey, look, I've written a game, it's on the App Store, it looks good, it takes this and this into consideration, I have worked with this third-party toolkit and integrated it in my game, they'll go, the hiring manager will go, great, I can put this person on tasks like that and they can complete them. As opposed to, oh, well, I've spent 3 years 3 or 4 years in school, and I've worked on many group projects, and the hiring manager will look and say, I don't know what you did on the group project. Did you drive it, or were you carried by your fellow classmates? So anything that you can show and say, this is me, this is my code. You can say, here's my GitHub repository with all the code samples of things that I've written. Here's my web page that shows all the sample programs that I've done. Anything that you can do to prove your skills, hiring managers will gladly look at.
All right, we're sitting down with Michael Duffy. We are talking about doing the work. We'll be right back. All right, so we are back with Michael Duffy. We're talking about all types of stuff, but right now I'd like to talk about working in teams. Little background with it. I think working with teams is a big part of scaling your independent game development business into an actual studio. And I recently, I've worked with artists, and more recently I had hired a programmer to work on something, and he did the work. He showed up and did the work, but I found I was not the best at managing people because I want to be their friend first ahead of everything. So I was hoping you could tell me and the listeners, what are some good tactics for working well within a team, having them want to do the good work for you, and making it a win-win?
That's a tough one, and it took me a while to learn the techniques of working with a team. So let's go back to kind of the start of my career. After I left Stardock, I decided to start my own company. And it was a company called Studio Blue, and I set up an office in Edmond, Oklahoma, and hired 2 artists out of the Art Institute of Dallas. got some funding, hired the artists, and then we all got in the office to make a role-playing game. And I was going to be the programmer. They were the two artists, and they were going to, the three of us were going to work and come up with a demo that we would then pitch to publishers. And, we'd sell it to a publisher, get in additional funding, grow the team, all live happily ever after. It didn't work out that way. And what I didn't realize at the time was how important management is. You can't just get everyone together in a room and expect everyone to magically go in the same direction and come up with the same product. There needs to be someone pointing everyone in the same direction and making sure that they're moving in the direction at the right speed. And so I completely neglected management when I ran my own company. And my artists got in there, and they're two very capable guys who went on to great careers in the industry. But I just said, okay, well, here's the game, here's the design doc, go make the art. And they're like, well, what do we make first? Do I even have the skills to make it? You need an art director. You wanting me to be the art director. They were looking for guidance and encouragement. I didn't realize, especially with artists, coming fresh out of school, just how much kind of encouragement and reinforcement and direction that they need in order to, really work to their potential. And so, left with no direction, and I was too busy trying to get the game engine working. We produced content. It was pretty, but it wasn't fast enough. It wasn't all the right content. And as a result, 2 years in, we had a demo, but it wasn't enough to actually convince a publisher. And so I realized that I learned from that and going on that you really do need someone who is in charge of where the project is going, what the overall plan is, who's working on it, who's assigned to what, and that person, may not make the decisions but of what's going into it, but they need to make sure that those decisions are getting made. And this is the product manager or the producer or whatnot. Or on a small team, it just has to be someone stepping up and taking charge of the project and driving it forward. The other thing you have to realize is when you're working on products, this isn't always to just make you feel good. And it's not, you're just not doing it to fulfill your dreams and to have fun. Those are great things if they come about and if they're part of it. But you have to treat it like a product, and you're working for the company. So whenever I've worked for larger companies, I realize that I am just contributing to this. This is not where I'm getting my self-worth. This is not going to fulfill me artistically to the very depths of my soul. I am in there providing a product, and providing a service for a product, and I'm working for the company. This is not my project. It is a project that I am working on, and I will do my best to make sure that that succeeds. But you have to take the ego out of it. And so when I contribute code to a project, I know that code may be thrown out. It may be rewritten. It may not do what they need it to, and I have to revise it. And that's just part of, taking your ego out of it and realizing that you are performing a service on a project. You aren't the project. It's not you. It's you're using your skills towards an end. So I think that's an important thing for the team, is to realize that everyone has to realize. You have to get everyone to realize that they are working on a product and they are contributing to it. But the end goal is the product, not themselves. It has to be, for the thing that you are trying to get out to sell, so that you can make money, so you can pay everyone, so you can keep on doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you had told me that at a certain point, and it really resonated with me in terms of when I was working with the programmer, feeling like I was losing some of my identity in the game I was creating, and I was starting to think like, well, is this authentic? Is this game idea and universe really coming from me? And how important is that? And I think at that point you had said, at the end of the day, what you're creating is a product. And I think some people, if you told them that their game is a product, they would probably storm out of here, because it is such an emotional endeavor. It's like graduate school. You put so much time into this thing that you've inflated it to something much larger than being a product. This is my identity. And I've certainly felt that way, especially with early releases I've done. I've been so closely attached to it that if people might be trying to be the squeaky wheel in a review, but they write something bad, and you start to take it personally. It's like, hey, this is 10 months of my life, man. Come on. Yeah. So it's an interesting approach to looking at what you're creating as a product. Could you talk a little bit more about that, maybe?
Yeah, and it's not something that comes natural to artists. And so, when you're growing up and you're in school, all of the art you do is for yourself. And, when you're in high school, when you're in college, you'll do projects that are an expression of yourself. And you'll dig deep into your own thoughts and experiences for inspiration. And so you are very much entwined with your art. And I think that's what a lot of people think in terms of what an artist is. And same thing even with game development. So, you're trying to come up with this thing that is uniquely you, and you put all your time and your effort and sweat and ideas into it. And then if it gets out and it's not well received, then you feel that's a direct reflection on you. And going from being, kind of, an amateur to a professional, in my mind, is being able to say, okay, when I create this art, I've built a skill set. I've developed, my skills through practice and, a lot of sweat and tears. And so I can create art if I, put my mind to it. I know how to, build a 3D model and texture it. I know how to, paint something. I know how to program something. And then being a professional is taking those skills and applying them, but kind of separating it from your identity. This is your skill set. This isn't just you. And you see that online a lot, where anyone who looks at the thing that they're creating and treats it as a way to make a living, they're seen as being a sellout. It's no longer pure. And I think that's a viewpoint of people who are very young and coming straight out of school, because that's in their lives so far, that's the only thing that's the only point of reference they have. That's the only way that they've created stuff, is from a very personal point of view. But as you grow up and you realize, okay, day in, day out, I need to do something with my life. And I also need to eat and have, a roof over my head. So ideally, I have to also do something to provide for myself, to make money so that, I can live. If you can have that be something that you enjoy doing, all the better. But the goal is to survive and take care of yourself, take care of, a family, when you get older and have one. And in order to do that, you have to have something that can be sold, you're going to give it to someone, and they're going to give you money in return. And you have to get over the fact and the idea that that's a bad thing. I mean, you don't want to rip people off. You want to give them something quality that they feel good about taking from you and giving you their hard-earned money for. So by all means, work towards giving them a good product that they want. But you have to get over the fact that selling something to someone in order for you to live is a bad thing, because you're going to be doing that no matter what. Whether you're off selling something of someone else's, whether you're going to be selling houses or insurance or, clothing at a store, you're going to have some economic transaction that's going to keep you alive. So all the better if that can be in a field that you enjoy working in, such as games, such as a creative endeavor. But for that to work, you have to get over the prejudice against being able to sell it to someone and have that be okay. That you're not diminishing your work. You're simply taking your work and creating something that someone else wants and that you can produce for them.
Yeah. Do you feel like there is a fine line within mobile games, though, of where it becomes somehow insidious, because we are building a product, and in some cases it can be a product that people become addicted to, and then you have put up either a paywall that's requiring people to pay. And I'm saying this a little bit as the devil's advocate because I've seen a lot of people have problems with monetization structures in mobile. What are your feelings about some of those tactics?
And that discussion has come up a lot with regard to loot boxes in AAA titles. A lot of people look down on mobile apps because they have a lot of monetization built into them. I'm still figuring out where I fall on the spectrum of what I like or not, because even if you are creating a game that is showing a lot of ads and showing and has a lot of monetization in it, and people are still engaging with it and giving and paying for their experience, you are providing a service, a product for someone. Now, that someone may be different from who a lot of people think you are selling to. For example, AAA games are generally played by gamers. If you're on a console, if you're on a PC, these are people whose main hobby is games, and they get highly invested in them. And so you get this mentality of what a gamer is. Mobile apps, mobile games may not be selling into that gamer mentality where competition is everything and the highest quality experience is everything, because you can provide that for the AAA title, but at a certain price. That level of quality requires a lot of people to create, and thus it's expensive to create those products. For mobile, you might be going for someone who's casually playing a game while the commercial's on for their favorite TV series. They're watching TV. Intermission comes up. They pull out their phone. They play a game for a little while, and then they put it aside. In a few minutes when the commercial's over, or they're going to bed at night and they're just playing around on their mobile phone until they get tired. And so, if people are buying your product, then you are providing a service and something desirable to someone. Otherwise, they wouldn't be buying it. And if no one's buying your game and you're not selling anything, then you should worry. Then no one actually wants what you're selling. But I don't worry too much if, for the products that are selling a lot to people because someone is wanting them and there is a demand, and if they wanted something else, they'd go find something else. So even if it's not hitting the target market where you think is the market you should be hitting, this isn't for gamers. The gameplay, I don't like the gameplay in this. It's like, no, but someone does. And you may not see them as a gamer, but they like what you're selling. And so as long as you're providing value to someone, I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. So you know what? I have a bunch of questions still. I didn't realize we would get so lost in these answers. It's great. I think we've gotten a lot of value out of everything you've talked about, and so I definitely would love to have you back. Maybe for a part 2 after you launch your app, we can talk a little bit about that. But I did want to have just one more point before we wrap up. You've shown me the game you've worked at our Appy Night Out, and I'm curious how your time at Game Circus has helped inform your view of what it takes to make a mobile game launch successful. Could you sort of share what you're going to be working towards that launch before we have you back in the future?
So I've learned a lot from working at Game Circus as far as how products are launched, and treating a game as a product, and what to look for. And I've learned a lot of different acronyms like KPI, Key Performance Indicator, and LTV, Lifetime Value. And these are all things in the industry you can go Google for, and there's plenty of YouTube videos out there that explain them. So I've seen with Game Circus how this works for a medium-sized company, about how important it is to do explicit user acquisition. You don't just upload something to the store and hope for the best. And I see a lot of people do that. They'll release their game, they'll talk about it on a few forums, and then be surprised when the money doesn't come in, and people they only get 10 or 20 downloads. And so I've seen from Game Circus's side how games are intentionally launched, and how you go out and intentionally get your first customers and get the advertising in front of people, how important it is to create good advertising so that people know about your product, how important it is to watch the metrics and see how people are reacting to it so that you can give them you can react to what they want and how they're behaving in your app. I've seen that work at the medium company level. What I'm curious about is, does it scale down to the one-person shop, where you are just struggling to get the game out, period? Can you also keep track of user acquisition and advertising and monetization and, bug fixing the game and producing something that people want and providing new content? So my own game is part of an experiment so that I can learn how this scales down, and so that I can have a better understanding of the entire process, so that when I'm in managing the programming department, I have context. I understand how user acquisition works, so I can work better with our user acquisition people. I understand how back-end services work, and so I can work better with those. I understand how data and analytics work, so I can better work with the data and analytics people. So if I just pigeonhole myself only in programming and client-side game programming, that limits my vocabulary and understanding of how I can relate to other people. So I think I know how to do this at the one-person level, but until I actually do it, I can't prove to myself or have proof that I've done it. So I'm very curious and excited how this project of mine is going to develop.
Yeah, and we are certainly excited to hear about it as well. Where can people find you online?
So I'm developing my game through Mucky Robot and muckyrobot.com, and also on Twitter and on Facebook. And also personally, I'm out there as mduffor, MDUFFOR, at .com, Gmail, Twitter, Reddit, you name it. That's kind of the name I use out there.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for coming out here and talking with us today. Best of luck with your release. Best of luck for Game Circus as well. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for having me on, Nick.
For show notes and links mentioned in the podcast, visit GameDevDeconstructed.com. Support the podcast by following us on Facebook and Twitter, and by rating and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you stream the show. That's all for this episode, and I hope to see you all next time.